Good evening. I'm going to start just a couple minutes early because our speaker has to catch a ferry. I mean, and if somebody asked, can he swim? And I said, yes, but he didn't bring his equipment. So it's the ferry. Anyway, this is our speaker tonight is going to be Dr. Zachary Randell from the Seattle Aquarium. And he grew up in Anchorage. So there you go. And for his undergraduate, he went to UC Santa Cruz. He keeps going by the water. And he studied scientific scuba diving. And then he moved up a little bit. I guess he's gone up and down the coast. Got his PhD at Oregon State in Corvallis. And he's currently a research scientist at Seattle Aquarium. And we didn't have any research scientists when I was there. So it's sort of exciting. And he's using an ROV to change the way we gather data along the seafloor. And mainly what you're going to see is, I believe, Puget Sound. And that's our front yard. I don't even call it our backyard. I think it's our front yard or backyard. Anyway, Zach?
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much, folks, for having me here. I'm going to share a bit about some research I've been leading at the Seattle Aquarium since March of 2022 when I moved up here from Oregon. So I lead a team of 2, soon-to-be 3 full-time staff members at the Seattle Aquarium, as well as probably about a dozen volunteers that are helping us out. So we definitely could not do this work without the assistance that we get from a lot of great folks. This is about an hour talk that I'm gonna skip over some parts so I can leave plenty of time for you all to ask questions at the end. And I still need to make the ferry, yes. So roadmap for today, why kelp forest? Why are we studying kelp forest? Then I'm going to talk a bit about the ROV framework that we're using. That's remotely operated vehicle. It's like a drone, but we fly it underwater. I will probably skip through most of this. This is the ROV positioning and control. You know how GPS works. You get a signal from a satellite. Trying to get positioning for something that's underwater is very, very difficult. So it's a whole subject. I'll probably breeze through this aspect a bit. I'll touch on some of the projects that we have underway. We have several grant-funded projects, one from the Port of Seattle and one from the state of Washington. And then I'll touch on AI. So you may be seeing a lot of AI, machine learning in the news. We are using AI to help us analyze images. One thing to note, this isn't some of the more fancy generative AI that can generate text. This is just the good old-fashioned try to identify things from images. And then if we have time, I can briefly touch on some data analysis, but we may skip through this part. All right, kelp forests. So kelp forests, as you may know, they are very important ecosystems. They're what we call foundational ecosystems, just like you have trees in the forests that provide shelter for many types of species. Kelp is the vegetation of the sea. And so many species of fish and invertebrates rely upon kelp. Kelp also facilitates what we call indirect interactions. So salmon will feed in a kelp forest, and they'll get nice and fat and healthy after coming out of the rivers. They fatten up in the kelp forest, and then they head out to sea. And that's where species like orca eat them. So the orca indirectly rely on the kelp because the kelp enables the salmon to get nice and healthy. So kelp kind of facilitates all these different food web interactions out in the nearshore ecosystem. It's also a very important ecosystem for many different folks living along the coast. So one great example of this is the Alaka Alliance. So let me turn on my little laser thing here. Yeah, okay. So this is a group in Oregon that is trying to recover sea otters along the coast of Oregon. Sea otters were completely wiped out in the maritime fur trade in the late 1800s, and the Alaka Alliance is trying to restore them. And it's not so much because they like sea otters, though that is part of it, but it's also because of, again, the indirect interactions that sea otters provide. The sea otters eat the sea urchins are eating all the kelp, and so by introducing sea otters, you're able to get more healthy kelp forests. So folks along the coast are trying to restore some of that ecological functioning that we see. So kelp is facing some challenges worldwide. So what I want to show you first on the left here, this is satellite imagery. Don't worry too much about the details. The green, this is canopy forming kelp. So there's some species of kelp that it attaches to the seafloor, it grows, it reaches the sea surface. And you can see it from a boat, you can see it from a drone or an airplane, or in this case, you can see it from a satellite. So that's the green at 4 different locations in Northern California. The kind of orangish beige, that is land, and then the whitish color is the sea. What you see here is that in 2014 and onwards, the kelp was just completely wiped out. And so you all may remember 2013, 14, 15, we had an anomalous warm water event. So we had it was called the blob of warm water that rolled in against the coastline and it just sat there. And we had anomalous warm water temperatures. It had a host of issues that came from that. So Pycnopodia, I don't know if you've heard of the sunflower star. It's this beautiful large sea star. There was a sea star wasting disease event. They basically all melted. We still don't really understand it, which is kind of wild because scientists were taking samples and analyzing it as it was happening. We still don't have a good sense of what happened with that event. As best we can tell, it was some sort of virus. But a near 99.5% range-wide extirpation of that species. Absolutely wild. So from Alaska to Baja California, almost a complete removal of that species during that warm water event. So a few other things happened. Sea urchins kind of rose to dominance with the kelp wiped away. The sea urchins, which rely upon kelp, they kind of started rampaging along the seafloor and established what you may know of as urchin barrens. You may or may not have heard of those, but it's when sea urchins actively roam across the seafloor and eat any kelp that starts to grow, and they basically can inhibit the future growth of kelp. So it's an alternative configuration of the ecosystem. And then here with abalone, with all the kelp gone, the abalone unfortunately starved to death and they actually had to close a fishery in Northern California. Sea urchins have this kind of weird quirk where they don't really starve to death. They just go into this low metabolic state. They're still alive. They're in poor body condition. They shrink. Their organs shrink, but they don't really die. So they can persist, and those urchin barrens can persist even when there's not really much food to sustain them. So kelp's having some challenges. And then this, I really like this quote, "What escapes the eye is a much more insidious kind of extinction, the extinction of ecological interactions." And that is just a nod towards when you lose a species or a suite of species, it's not just those core focal individuals that are gone, it's the functioning, the interactions among the various species, including the indirect interactions that you may lose. And there's a variety of other challenges kelp forests face as well. Invasive species are becoming more prevalent, especially creeping up from Southern California, where they originally came from shipping barge ballast water. So sargassum is an invasive algae. It does form a bit of structure, but it doesn't reach the sea surface like some of the other kelp species. So this is taking over, and then you're also getting what's called the rise of turfs. So instead of the big, lush vegetation formed by brown algae, this turf algae, it kind of like grass, the grass of the sea. It's just a very short kind of shrubby vegetation. So there's a variety of challenges here with kelp. In Puget Sound, Warm water seems to be an issue. We're seeing in some places a 95% decline of bull kelp, the primary surface canopy kelp. We think that largely has to do with increasing water temperatures in Puget Sound. That's most pronounced in South Puget Sound. For example, around Squaxin Island, there was a healthy bull kelp population there that is entirely gone now for the first time as of, I believe, 2022. Now, I was originally drawn to these ecosystems because of how visually dynamic they are. There's an incredible diversity of species present down there, and as I learned more and more about the science, I was fascinated by how much variation there can be, both across space and across time, and it makes them really, really interesting to study. For my graduate work, I spent a lot of time scientific diving out at a couple sites in California that allowed me to dig into this. So throughout this talk, I'm going to talk about ROVs, robotics essentially, and some software. And my background is not in any of that, actually. My background is as a field biologist, so a lot of scuba diving and studying the systems in situ, essentially. For part of my work in grad school, I was part of a program that has been monitoring fixed subtidal sites. So underwater, divers go down around one island, San Nicolas Island and the Channel Islands, and they have been going to that island, the same 7 sites, twice a year for 40 years. So that's generated a time series. It's an incredible time series. It's one of the longest time series of kelp forest dynamics that we have. And it provided amazing temporal insight into how these ecosystems change or don't change. So for example, for my PhD, I dug into why certain sites flip back and forth between a kelp forest and an urchin barren every 10, 15 years or so, just get this back and forth switch, versus another site 2 kilometers away that has never exhibited anything other than a healthy, resilient kelp forest. So my grad studies was trying to dig into understanding the underlying processes behind those distinct dynamics. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about that, but one thing about San Nicolas that I want to emphasize is these 2 images down here. This is bathymetry. Again, don't worry about the details. The blue is like a flat sedimentary site. And then all the red here, these are big pinnacle structures. What I really want you to just see is that there's these teeny little slices of seafloor denoted by color. So these are 10 by 2 meter transects. So those are the fixed sites. There's bolts in the seafloor where we as divers go down and we lay out our meter tape and we count everything encompassed in those 10 by 2 meter transects. And why I'm showing it is because they are but teeny little splinters of the seafloor. So when it comes to statistical inference, I can speak to those exact little spots and nothing further because we aren't covering that much area. So it really got me thinking in the latter years of my PhD, how can we start to get more information about the kelp, the invertebrates, the fish, the underlying substrate? We got to be able to speak to broader spatial areas than we currently can. And that led us to ROVs, remotely operated vehicles. So ROVs have been around for a while. They are typically very large, very expensive, deployed off large seafaring vessels to explore way out in deep parts of the ocean. And it's only recently, in the past 10, but really 5 years, that companies have came along offering very capable ROVs or parts for ROVs that are low cost and accessible to just about anyone and can perform science-worthy, standardized, rigorous surveys. And so this company, Blue Robotics, they are the ones that sell the hardware that we use. Our entire ROV, you can get it for about $7,000, which is, you know, it's not nothing, but it's not a $2 million ROV. And one of the nice things about this company is that they sell not just the entire ROV, but it's modular. So if you need just a thruster, they sell the thruster. If you need just an electronics enclosure, they sell that. So what other companies have done is start purchasing these components and building their own ROVs that they turn around and sell. So Blue Robotics is now the leader in the industry of small, inexpensive, yet capable hardware. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. This is just to note that you have these 4 vertical thrusters, and then there's 4 lateral thrusters, so you have a high degree of movement and stability with these ROVs, which I'll show you with a couple videos shortly. So we've gone through a couple different formulations from the ROV. This is the smaller one with a single level here. This is the sport model. You'll see here we have these lights integrated, and then these little plastic bars here, HDPE paneling, which I've bent to basically prevent kelp stipes from getting caught up in those lights. There's also another version, a slightly larger version. You now see this lower level present here, and this gives us a bit more room to incorporate cameras, or in our case now, a larger set of lights. We're shooting photos, and so to get really fast shutter speeds and low ISO settings, basically to shoot high resolution, crisp photos while the vehicle is moving, we need a lot of light. And so I'll show you a couple short videos here. This is the ROV. So I'm filming this as a diver with a little GoPro. This is at Elliott Bay Marina, the breakwater. We're laying a meter tape that divers are collecting data, and then the ROV is going to collect data from the exact same spot as part of a methods comparison, so we can understand the data collected by both and how it differs and how we want to optimize how the ROV is utilized. So the ROV is just going to descend here. So you heard that noise. There's like a whoa, 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 kind of a drum. I'll replay that. See if you can catch it. Does anyone know what that noise is? It's actually the state ferries. You know, yeah, you can hear the screws, the props kilometers away. So let's see if you can. Yes. So I'm going to show you another one here. So you see this white tape laid out. So this is how we as scientific divers conduct standardized surveys. We lay out a 10-meter transect or a 30-meter or 100-meter, depending on the type of survey. But then we know how long of a length of seafloor have we gathered information. And that allows us to standardize our data collection. So we typically gather information on 1 meter on either side of the tape. So we'll be counting everything on either side. So these anemones, for example, would be counted. They'd be captured by the diver. And so for this study, the ROV is cruising over, gathering video imagery with a downward-facing camera and forward-facing camera from that same area. So you'll just see the ROV cruising. And you can see with these downward-facing lights, we're lighting up the seafloor extensively. And so all this brown that you're seeing, this kind of dark stuff, this is all kelp. This is an understory species of kelp, sugar kelp, that doesn't reach the sea surface. But it's still really important. It's kind of like the bushes and the shrubs of the forest. And as you see here, my buddy Alex diving, the ROV is quite small. So it's small. It can be deployed off of a small vessel. And so we can make use of this technology in coastal shallow waters. Can anyone think of any issues running an ROV in canopy-forming kelp? Getting caught. Yeah, I heard a couple people say getting caught. Yeah, so getting the tether caught. So you can see this line running out the back of it. So that's providing a video feed so we can pilot the ROV in real time. We use an Xbox game controller, a video game controller essentially. And that tether also supplies power to the ROV. And so if you lose that tether, you have no control over the vehicle whatsoever. So you have to have that tether, and yet the tether can get wrapped around things. So what we've figured out are ways to get into and out of the kelp without running into too much trouble. Essentially, we go straight into a forest and get ourselves into all sorts of complications. And then to get out, we turn around, pan the built-in camera up, locate the tether, and then we follow that tether back out of the bed very carefully. And so we have to undo whatever it is that we did to get into the bed. And so I'm going to show you an example of what this looks like right here. This is an example of how we got ourselves into trouble. Not really, but so bull kelp grows a single plant as a single stipe, a single strand essentially. But they all grow close together and they get wrapped up in a bundle. So what you see here are multiple individual bull kelp plants that have all been tangled together. And on our survey, we just drove straight through that mess. Now that tether that is positively buoyant has crept up and it's kind of caught up here in the midst of it. So to get ourselves out, I'm going to pilot the ROV and move it laterally, and then someone on the boat is going to put tension on that tether, and we're basically going to pull this whole tangle apart and create an opening that we can then fly through and get ourselves out of this mess. And I'll just say these are kelp crabs. They may be one factor that is actually limiting bull kelp in Elliott Bay. They are herbivores, they eat the kelp, and what we find is they eat the blades of the kelp, the fronds, and that's where the reproductive structures are. We're not sure when the kelp crabs come out and first start grazing, but if it's too early in the season, that could actually be a limitation for bull kelp. They could be eating the spores before they're released. So lots of bull kelp. Often we go and do these surveys, and the bull kelp, it's naked. It's just a single bulb with no fronds or blades coming off. So that is what you shall see. Oops. Now, okay. So now this little kelp crab is actually going to resist the tension that we're putting on. It's going to try holding out, but it can't hold out forever. So I'm moving the ROV laterally, and we're creating this opening in the bull kelp while also maintaining tension on the tether. So because the ROV is small and it's fairly maneuverable, we can just zip right on through. All right, so now I'm going to give you a sense of what the ROV sees. These are two videos from two cameras that have been synchronized together. So this is the downward-facing view, obviously, and then the forward-facing view. This is from right in between Pier 60, the Seattle Aquarium, and Pier 62. So if you ever are right in that area and you look overboard over the seawall and you see the e-scooters and everything, this is essentially right there. And as you can imagine, for the downward-facing view, there is a huge amount of information encoded here about what's on the seafloor. The green algae, the red algae, the brown algae. As divers, we go down with a plastic slate and plasticized paper, and we tick off, 1 sea star, 2 sea urchins, etc. With video and photos, we can capture huge amounts of information. Okay. So just to give you a sense of our data collection methods, so we go down and we were shooting video, but there's a bit of image degradation when we extract still images, so we've switched to shooting photos, and that's why we need all that light to shoot nice, crisp, high-resolution photos. And as you can see with the current methods, it's working pretty well for us. Unfortunately, there's a fair amount of debris off the side of the Seattle Aquarium, but it illustrates the sharpness of the image. Alrighty. So I'm going to briefly touch on ROV positioning because it's really quite interesting. So in order to get a location for a vehicle underwater, there's no GPS. GPS doesn't go through water. So we actually use two different systems. There's an acoustic system. So there's an acoustic signal that's transmitted from the ROV and then is received by the vessel. And then there's a topside system that has a GPS on the vessel and gets a compass heading. And it's the integration of those two data which gets you a GPS position for the ROV underwater. So that sounds great, but in reality, it's been one of the biggest challenges for our project is to get good geospatial tracking of the ROV. And this was something where one of our volunteers, a special projects volunteer, came along and helped us out and wrote some custom code. He's a retired software developer, and we were able to identify that the acoustic portion of that system is performing really well, but the top side, the GPS and the compass, it was really buggy. It was really air prone. So there was noise, there was drift in the compass readings, and then that information got propagated to the rest of the calculations. And so we were left with very, very noisy tracking data. So long story short, we were able to resolve this, and we now have very nice looking GPS data and very nice looking data from another sensor called a Doppler velocity log. So this sends 4 acoustic beams down to the seafloor. They bounce back up, and we can precisely track how the ROV moves across the seafloor. So this is really important because for us to conduct standardized surveys, we need to know how far the ROV has gone. Just like the divers lay out a 30-meter transect tape, we have to know, has the ROV gone 30 meters or 50 meters? Otherwise, we have no idea how much area we've filmed with the ROV. So a big part of our work, at least in the first 2 years, has been dialing in the methods in order to use relatively low-cost components and sensors to conduct this work. Part of the reason we're wanting to keep it as low-cost sensors is that we're trying to build out a framework of hardware that other groups can adopt. So the Seattle Aquarium, as a nonprofit, we're not trying to sell anything or copyright or anything. We're trying to develop a aggregation of hardware that groups that we collaborate with could replicate essentially, and then they can go out and do similar surveys. So I'm going to skip through this largely. The next step for our sensors and the tracking of the ROV is to basically fuse all that information together, fuse the information from the DVL and from the GPS in order to give a single real-time output of the vehicle. And I'm going to skip this, but I'm going to talk about one of the aspects of the work that I'm really excited about. As you can imagine, you need to keep, if you're going to be gathering imagery of the seafloor, you want to gather that imagery in a consistent manner. If this is the seafloor and this is the ROV, if I'm filming a sea urchin like this, and then the ROV is way up here, 2 meters higher, that sea urchin is going to look really big, then really small. That's a bit of a challenge. That's going to be a challenge if we're using any sort of AI to process the images. So we want to keep that ROV at a really consistent altitude above the seafloor. And so that's what's being represented here, the ROV cruising, taking these snapshots of the seafloor. So this is where Clyde, our special projects volunteer, again came with some custom software, and he actually wrote a program that takes information from the DVL, that downward-looking sonar, and uses it to regulate the altitude of the ROV. And it actually works really well. He worked on it for over a year. We tested it multiple times and got it dialed in, and we got it to the point, don't worry too much about the details of these figures. This basically shows the seafloor right here, and then the altitude of the ROV. And so what you see is it lines up really well. The ROV is consistently 1 meter above the seafloor, and that's all done through the ROV autonomously flying itself, essentially. So that was really exciting. Here you see the same thing, only it's quite a bit more noisy. The reason being this was the ROV flying over really complex, rocky substrate. So it was challenging. The sensor was constantly having to make little adjustments to the altitude of the ROV in order to achieve that 1 meter distance. But so what's really cool about this, you may have heard open source. So what that basically means, the source code is open and freely available. So all the programs that Clyde writes, it's open source, and it's now actually been incorporated into the firmware of the ROV itself. So anyone that goes out and flies an ROV using the firmware RGSub 4.5 beta will have access to SurfTrack. And it's really exciting because we're collaborating with multiple other groups that are using an ROV configured similarly to ours, and now they're able to use SurfTrack as well. So just a quick shout out to where we're wanting to go with this automation track. There's something called visual odometry. It's very slick. I don't fully understand what is going on under the hood, but you can imagine if you have an ROV with a camera facing down and you're lighting up the seafloor so the camera can see the seafloor, as the ROV moves, that camera can track how a little pebble is moving. With that visual information and a lot of math, you're able to calculate precisely how the ROV is moving, how fast it's moving, the distances it's moved. And so you're basically using visual odometry, to using the visual to measure the movement. So it's hypothetically supposed to be even more accurate than the acoustic sonar beams that are going down and bouncing back up. It's also going to be faster, right? Because the visual, the camera just sees it, whereas the acoustics, the beam has to go down and then come back up. So we'll be able to use that visual information to regulate SurfTrack, that program adjusting the altitude of the ROV. So I mentioned this briefly, but we're trying to put as much of our work out in the public domain as possible. So if you all go to this URL, and I'm sure this could be emailed out, it might have been in the invite actually, you'll see tons of videos. We have a whole page with different videos from the ROV. And so we're trying to get it all out in the public domain. So if folks want to interact with this in any way or replicate it, they can. I'm going to skip through that. I will briefly touch on what projects we have. So the first project that we got funded was from the Port of Seattle. And so they were very interested in better understanding what we call urban kelp. So oftentimes you hear about kelp in beautiful, pristine parts of the state, but what the port was really interested in are the kelp beds that are right here in Elliott Bay, in some very heavily utilized and trafficked waterways. And it was interesting, what they've seen is that kelp doesn't just uniformly thrive. It does really well in certain areas and is completely absent in other areas. They've partnered with Puget Sound Restoration Fund to do some bull kelp restoration, so going out and planting the spores essentially for kelp in the environment. And it works really well in some spots and completely fails in others. So the idea of this project was to better understand the local scale factors. So local, what's in the immediate area, the type of seafloor substrate, other kelp species that may be competing, other herbivores that may be consuming kelp. Let's understand those local scale factors to see if we can understand why kelp is persisting or not. So this project worked out really well for us because the Seattle Aquarium is right here along the Seattle waterfront. So we were able to essentially develop these methods iteratively, lots of problem solving from the ground up in order to go out and establish this network of sites. So we have 8 sites. You just saw a video from right offshore of Elliott Bay Marina Breakwater where we go out and conduct these ROV surveys. And this is to give you a sense of what some of those sites look like. So these are, each little line here is an individual survey, or what we call a transect. So you can see precisely where the ROV flew because of that geospatial recording that I was talking about earlier. So we have these 8 sites. We have surveyed them 3 times annually. We just wrapped up our 3rd year 2 weeks ago, and we will be doing this work for at least 1 more year, and we'll be doing some winter surveys coming up in January to capture imagery of the seafloor when the annual kelp is gone. So kelp's an annual, it grows, reproduces, and then dies back. And so in the winter, we can go out and capture imagery of the underlying seafloor to better understand what that substrate is that the kelp grows on. Okay, we have another project funded by HSIL. So that's a cooperation between Department of Fish and Wildlife and Department of Natural Resources with money from the EPA. So there's 3 main goals of this project. 1, that methods comparison, so that video I showed you of the ROV taken by a diver, that is to understand how the data collected by ROVs differs compared to data collected by divers on the same exact survey or transect on the same day. So that's, again, to understand just what is the utility of this method that we've developed, how does it differ from divers, and what do we want to do with it going forward. We're also flying the ROV with Puget Sound Restoration Fund. They're doing the kelp restoration, growing the bull kelp, outplanting it, and so we're seeing how useful is the ROV for that. And then finally, there is a spatial modeling component as well that I probably won't get into too many details right now. Okay, we have one final project, which is largely at the early stage, and that is to go out and take this work out to the outer coast. So the Olympic coast of Washington. The aquarium's vessel can't operate way out there south of Tatoosh, so we're largely restricted to the Strait of Juan de Fuca. So we've done a few trips out there, and we started building partnerships with the Macaw and the Quileute and the Ho and some of the other groups out there as well. And we hope to get out there in the coming years. It's a very different ecosystem out there. It's far more diverse in terms of species present than what you see in Elliott Bay. So there's a lot of really interesting ecological questions waiting for us out there. Okay, I'm going to kind of breeze through the AI portion because I want to give you all some time to ask questions. So I think I will just say at a very high level, we're using some open source, so freely available AI software to try to extract or generate data from our imagery. So you can do something called object detection, where you can put a box around a sea star to help train the algorithm, or a rockfish, or bull kelp stipes. And then a different type of metric is something called percent coverage. So as you can see here with the red algae, you can't really tell where one single individual is or where one blade of red algae begins and another one ends. So it's more aggregate. So that's where you can overlay multiple data points and then annotate what each one of those is, and then that can help, again, train the algorithm. So I think I'm going to kind of skip through this unless you really want to get into the weeds of it. I'll just kind of fly through. Sorry. One aspect that I'll briefly touch on that's kind of neat is one of the biggest challenges with AI for image processing is getting what's called a labeled data set. So a labeled data set are a set of images that someone has gone through and put a box around a thing, like the coral, that then conveys the information, this is what coral looks like, and then the algorithm learns, essentially. So you need thousands upon thousands of images that have been annotated. And this is just a human typically putting a box around a thing. So for us, what we're going to end up doing is rolling out a project on Zooniverse, which is a website that was originally started by astronomy researchers to help get the public to engage with their imagery. So the public could go see, there's a gamma ray burst, right, and put a box around that. And then the astronomy researchers would use that information to train their AI. Well, now researchers from all over the world can host a project on Zooniverse, all different types of projects. So there'll be one where folks can read love letters from soldiers in the Civil War, for example, back home, and type out what those are. So the algorithm can learn to read that type of handwriting. So we are going to roll out a project on Zooniverse as well. So people from all over the world will be able to interact with images of the seafloor of Elliott Bay and help us find organisms that will help us analyze our data, essentially. So I think I'm going to kind of leave it there so that there's plenty of time for questions. I think the last thing I'll say is that ROVs are super cool, and they're the area that we're focused on, but it's really just one of many sensor platforms out there. And so the ultimate end objective is to bring together the data from all these different platforms in order to better understand what's going on in these ecosystems and better guide conservation, restoration, and management. So with that, I will happily take questions.
We've got 3 microphones, and I've got a question. No, thank you, we've got 3.
Your definition of algae, is that any vegetative growth in water? In other words, it could be large or small. I always thought of algae as like the green stuff that floats on top of
Yeah,
water.
great question. So there's many different types of algae. Brown algae is kelp, green algae, red algae, and then there's also plankton, which may be considered a photosynthetic type of algae, depending on what type it is. The only thing that isn't an algae that's growing underwater are going to be something like seagrass or eelgrass, which are a true flowering plant. But everything else, algae and kelp, they're their own super weird category of life. They're technically grouped into the kingdom protista. So, single cellular amoebas are a protist. It's kind of a catch-all for very weird, obscure things of life.
Are all kelp seasonal? You mentioned at least one. Are all of them seasonal?
No, they're not. So there's some species, there's species of understory that can live for 10, 12, 20 years. There's species, a woody stipe that can grow about this tall, pterogophora, and have big fronds, and they can form forests that persist for decades. Yeah, bull kelp isn't even annual up in the San Juan Islands where it's colder and you have a lot more nutrients. It'll stick around year-round up there, but it's absolutely seasonal down here where it's a bit warmer.
So in the areas that you have studied, what's your assessment of the overall health of those areas?
Yeah, it's a really hard question to answer. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the expression shifted baseline. So I've been seeing these systems roughly since 2011 when I started diving in them. But obviously there's plenty of impact that could have happened before that point. So I don't even necessarily know what a pristine kelp forest looks like. I don't know if anyone alive today has seen that. That being said, I think these ecosystems are facing challenges. I think there's reason for hope. It's not entirely doom and gloom, but there's absolutely certain areas and certain species that are struggling. South Puget Sound, the bull kelp is really having a hard time, and it's not altogether clear that it's going to be able to persist there with warming waters, as well as changes to shoreline use and some increased sedimentation that is just restricting the growth in those southern areas. So it's a mixed bag, but I do remain optimistic.
You had one excellent photo of showing Elliott Bay, and it looked like there were deep blue rivers in there. What were we seeing?
Yeah, so that's the underlying bathymetry of Elliott Bay. So that's essentially
That's it, yeah.
the depth. So I can't speak exactly to what caused this, but these are the deeper areas. I know that a good chunk of Puget Sound was glacially excavated. I don't know exactly if that is what we're seeing there. But yeah, that's the depth. So that's the deeper parts of Elliott Bay. What I can tell you is that it's kind of hard to see there, but if you zoom in on the bathymetry on the east and west waterways, you can see that those whole areas were excavated to allow those shipping containers to go in.
Because this can't be due to inflow from the land because there isn't any water coming in. So
There's the Duwamish waterway, which is, over here and has fresh water coming out through the east and the west waterway. But yeah, I think that's just part of the natural topography of Elliott Bay.
A real quick question. With the ROV, what kind of adjustments do you need to make to handle all of our tidal flows and currents that are naturally occurring?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if I'm smart, which sometimes I am, but sometimes I'm not, I will only try to fly the ROV at slack high tide, when there's not a lot of current, which makes my life and the ROV's life quite a bit easier. We can compensate for approximately 2, maybe 3 knots of current by cranking up the thrusters, the power of the thrusters. The problem is that chews through battery life. We've somewhat mitigated that issue by supplying power from the vessel, so the ROV can stay down much longer. So if we have to fight the current, we can. But to be perfectly frank, you just got to pick your day properly. So I spend a lot of time looking at tide charts, and you just pick your day. Same goes for seasonality. So you may know about algal blooms. So in the heat of the summer and the sunlight, you get algae, planktonic algae that grows, and our water turns green, essentially, or brown. As a diver, I might not be able to see my hand in July. So we don't even bother flying the ROV May, June, July, first half of August, because if you're trying to obtain good quality imagery, it's just not going to happen. So you have to pick your day with the tides. You have to pick your season for water clarity. So our summer surveys are latter half of August, September, October. And then we also do the winter surveys, like I mentioned, December, January, February.
Thank you. I'm over here. This is so, my mind is bursting. But anyway, I'm sure everybody's appreciative as I am. So you're talking about the historical record, which of course you started diving whenever just a few years ago, relative to how long Puget Sound's been here. Are there other kinds of records? Of course, I'm thinking, do kelp make fossil records? Probably not. But what kind of historical records actually might be available, if any?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a couple. Some indigenous populations have been in the area, and so there have been efforts by DNR to go and talk to some of those elders and try to visually map out where they remembered kelp to be in Elliott Bay and the broader Washington coast. So there is some anecdotal evidence for where kelp was present, but that doesn't necessarily get to the broader community. They were not able to put eyes on the seafloor, though they certainly pulled quite a bit out and were able to live off the coast. So there is knowledge there. Going further back, kelp are not going to form fossils. They're ripped up annually and rapidly degraded and consumed. So there's just kind of constant turnover of the kelp. It's one of the reasons why if you ever hear blue carbon and carbon sequestration, there's some potentially great potential there, but kelp, it turns over every year, degrades, regrows, degrades. That carbon isn't really trapped anywhere. I have seen some papers, very few, looking at kelp isotopes in species like abalone shells, which may be in middens that go back thousands of years. So you can kind of sort of start to approach rough, I mean really rough, as in a certain proportion of red algae, a certain proportion of green, and a certain proportion of brown in the isotopic composition of some kind of fossil records. But we have very limited knowledge about what was present thousands of years ago.
Well, I'm concerned. You said that the rising temperature, particularly in the southern part of Puget Sound, was interfering with the kelp. Are there species of kelp that thrive in hotter temperatures? With global warming, what are we going to have happen?
Yes and no. If you look at the worldwide distribution of coral reefs and kelp forests, they're non-overlapping. And you have kelp forests in the high latitudes, so way up in North America and way far down, like the southern tip of South America, you'll also get kelp forests. And then you have coral reefs in the middle, around the equator where it's nice and warm. So there's some algae that does grow in warm water, but it's not really the kelp type species. It's not the big vegetation forming species that we rely upon. There's some subpopulations of kelp that may do better than others when it comes to warming water temperatures, and that's an active area of research that people are investigating. They're doing some transplant experiments, taking cold water kelp and putting it in warm water locations and vice versa to try to see if there's some sort of response. But the kelp can tolerate some degree of increase, but it can't turn into a coral reef out there and have kelp as well.
I have a part that I just didn't understand. You were referring to the kelp forests that are out in the islands as being, it sounded like hardier than the stuff that's in southern Puget Sound. Does that mean that because the water is colder and has more nutrients or something?
Yep, yeah, exactly that. And one extra piece. So kelp likes it really cold, kelp likes lots of nutrients, and the high water flow of some of the areas in the San Juan Islands, you can just imagine there's so much more nutrients being flushed through those areas that the kelp can grow much larger, much thicker, longer blades, compared to what we see in Elliott Bay. My title slide had kelp from the San Juan Islands, and you can just see these incredibly long blades that you just don't see blades like that here in Elliott Bay. Like this, you can't really tell, but that could be 25 feet long.
Okay, we have one last question, and then I'm going to have to call it because I promised I'd let him get it to his ferry.
Okay, go, Tom. You're the
Go ahead, Tom.
I'm curious about your people science. What is it, the Zoo Nation or whatever it was, where anyone can get on and start drawing boxes around organisms.
Yeah.
How do you correct for errors? I mean,
Yeah, it's a great question. So one strategy is you have multiple people annotate the same image. And so I don't know if you saw all the multiple boxes around the one image. So that's from different individual users. They're not seeing the other annotations. Each person is presented with the same image. And then you can just do some math and take an average of all of those and get the final output, which is hypothetically a nice clean box around the thing.
Okay. If you have other questions, I'd say you could email them to me, and I'll send them on to Zach, and then maybe he'll answer you. Also, he would. Come June, we'll have some more, and we may have some more of his pictures that we can show during the Ocean Awareness Day, which is the beginning of June. So stay tuned.
Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time. And if you haven't seen the website, I think the link was sent around. There's lots and lots of videos and information on the website. So if you want to learn more, it's all out there. So again, thanks, folks.